The silence was a physical thing, a weight pressed against his eardrums. It was the first and last lesson of the Institute. Silence was purity, the absence of chaotic, organic noise. Here, in the white-walled, white-floored, white-ceilinged room he had called home for as long as memory was permitted, sound was a contaminant. His own breath was a regulated, shallow whisper, a metronome of obedience. His heartbeat, a soft, muffled drum against his ribs, was monitored by the slender silver band on his wrist. Its data fed into the central system that governed his existence. He was subject 734, an omega, a calibrated omega, the culmination of generations of selective breeding and psychological conditioning designed to be the perfect vessel, placid, receptive, and utterly devoid of the volatile instincts that had once defined his designation. He sat on the edge of his sterile cot, the synthetic fabric cool and textureless against his skin. His hands rested on his knees, palms up, a posture of serene neutrality drilled into him since childhood. He stared at the opposite wall, a seamless expanse of polymer that reflected a pale, distorted version of himself, a ghost in a white tunic with hair the color of ash and eyes the shade of a winter sky. There were no mirrors in the Institute. Reflections were a source of identity, and identity was a precursor to ego. Ego was chaos. His own face was a stranger to him, a collection of features he knew only through the dispassionate descriptions in his file. The air, recycled and scent neutralized, carried nothing. No dust motes danced in the flat, shadowless light that emanated from the ceiling panels. No hint of food from the nutrient paste he was given. No trace of the cleaning solvents used by the silent, gliding drones. No whisper of another living being. The suppression of scent was the cornerstone of his conditioning. Pheromones were the language of the primal self, a chaotic symphony of desire, fear, and dominance. His own scent was a carefully balanced, near undetectable whisper of ozone and sterile linen, the olfactory equivalent of a blank page. He was not meant to send signals, only to receive one, singular, authorized command. A soft chime, the only sound ever permitted to break the silence, echoed through the room. It was not jarring. It was a perfectly modulated frequency designed to alert without startling. It meant he was summoned. He rose in a single, fluid motion, his bare feet making no sound on the floor. The wall in front of him shimmered, becoming translucent, then dissolved into a doorway of soft, white light. Beyond it stood a proctor, clad in the same immaculate white, their face obscured by a polished chrome visor that reflected his own indistinct form back at him. The proctor did not speak. They never did. They simply tilted their head, a gesture of command. He walked, his pace measured, his gaze fixed straight ahead. The corridor was identical to his room, endless, seamless white. The silence was deeper here, absorbed by the sheer scale of the architecture. They passed other dissolved doorways, other silent rooms holding other calibrated omegas, his brothers and sisters in placidity, all waiting for a chime that might never come. He was an asset. He was an experiment. He was a promise of a future where the messy, unpredictable nature of alpha-omega dynamics was replaced by perfect, systemic order. He felt nothing. Not anticipation, not fear, not curiosity. These were unregulated emotions, excised from his repertoire. He felt only a quiet hum of function, the feeling of a machine switched from standby to active. The journey ended before a set of immense, imposing doors that were not white. They were black, carved from some dark, veined stone that seemed to drink the light. This was a deviation, a disruption in the perfect, sterile world he knew. He felt the first flicker of something unfamiliar, a low-frequency vibration in his sternum. It was not an emotion, it was a sensation. The proctor stopped, and the silver band on his wrist pulsed with a soft green light, an authorization. The black doors slid apart with a low, grinding groan, a sound so alien and visceral it made the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. The room beyond was a cavern of shadows, a muted color. The air was thick, heavy, and alive. It carried scents, so many scents. Old stone, rain-dampened earth, beeswax, decaying paper, and something else. Something dominant, electric, a low thrum of power that tasted like ozone and dark, rich soil after a lightning strike. It was an alpha's scent, not the diluted, sanitized samples used in his training, but the real, unfiltered thing. It flooded his senses, bypassing his conditioning and striking a chord deep within his primal DNA. A dormant part of him, a part he never knew existed, stirred. In the center of the room, on a throne that seemed carved from a single piece of obsidian, sat a man, the Alpha King. He was a figure of myth, the apex of their hierarchy, the ultimate authority. Elian had seen his image in data slates, a face of cold, regal perfection. But the image was a pale imitation. The reality of his presence was overwhelming. He was larger than Elian had imagined, broad-shouldered and draped in dark fabrics that absorbed the dim light. His hair was the color of polished jet, and his eyes, even from this distance, seemed to hold a chilling intensity. The scent, that powerful, grounding scent of storm and earth, emanated from him like a gravitational field, pulling the very air toward him. Elian stopped just inside the doorway, his programming dictating the precise distance. He lowered his gaze to the floor, his hands assuming the neutral posture at his sides. The silence in this room was different. It was not empty. It was filled with presence, with unspoken weight. He could hear the soft crackle of a fire somewhere out of sight. He could hear the impossibly loud, frantic beat of his own heart. The silver band on his wrist was flashing a frantic, cautionary yellow. Biofeedback anomaly. Unregulated cardiac acceleration. The king did not move for a long time. Elian could feel his gaze, a physical weight on the top of his head, his shoulders. He was being assessed, catalogued, a piece of pristine equipment being inspected by its new owner. The thought was not his own. It was a fragment of his conditioning, a simple statement of fact. He was an asset. Then, the king spoke. His voice was not loud, but it filled the vast chamber, a low, resonant baritone that vibrated through the stone floor and up through the soles of Elian's feet. Come here. It was not a request, it was a statement of absolute, undeniable power. It was the singular, authorized command his entire existence had been engineered to obey, and his body responded before his mind could even process the words. A tremor went through him, a full-body shudder that was not of fear, but of something deeper, more instinctual. His knees unlocked. The strength drained from them in a sudden, shocking rush, and they gave way. He didn't fall. It was not a collapse. His knees simply moved, bending, lowering him toward the cold stone floor in an act of profound, involuntary submission. He caught himself on his hands, his palms flat against the stone, the unfamiliar rough texture a jolt to his system. His head was bowed, his entire body trembling with the force of a command that had bypassed every layer of his conditioning and spoken directly to the core of his biology. He was on his knees, not because he had been told to kneel, but because the Alpha King had said, "Come here," and his very being, the ancient, repressed Omega within him, knew no other way to respond. The silence that followed was broken only by his own ragged, stolen breaths. He was no longer a blank page. He was a storm. The cold of the stone floor seeped through the thin fabric of his tunic, a grounding sensation in the maelstrom of his senses. He remained on his hands and knees, head bowed, the image of perfect submission. But inside, it was chaos. The silver band on his wrist was a frantic, strobing red. Critical biofeedback anomaly. System override imminent. His meticulously calibrated neutrality had shattered into a million pieces. The king's scent was a physical presence in his lungs, a complex tapestry of storm-charged air, wet earth, and an undercurrent of something deeply melancholic, like old books and cold embers. It was terrifying. It was intoxicating. It was the first truly real thing he had ever smelled. He heard the soft scrape of leather on stone. The king was moving. Elian's entire body tensed, a wire pulled taut. Every instinct screamed at him to press himself flatter to the floor, to make himself smaller, to disappear. His conditioning warred with this primal urge, one demanding serene stillness, the other demanding absolute deference. The result was a fine, uncontrollable tremor that shook his frame. He squeezed his eyes shut as if darkness could hide him. A pair of black boots, polished to a dull sheen, entered his limited field of vision. They stopped a mere foot from his hands. The scent intensified, and a wave of dizziness washed over him. It was too much. After a lifetime of sterile air, this raw, potent pheromonal signature was a sensory assault. The king's presence was a shadow that fell over him, blocking out the dim light from the distant braziers. He was a mountain, and Elian was a stone at its base. "Subject 734, the king said, his voice closer now, still low and resonant, but with a new edge to it, something that sounded like curiosity, or perhaps clinical assessment. Your response is irregular. The Institute's data assured me of perfect compliance, not atavistic displays." Atavistic. The word hung in the air. A regression to an ancestral type. He was failing. The experiment was flawed. A cold dread, a feeling he could finally identify, trickled through him. Failure meant recalibration. It meant being taken back to the White Room, to the needles and the machines, and the systematic erasure of whatever this chaotic, terrifying thing was that had just awakened inside him. The thought was so horrifying that it spurred him to action. He had to regain control. He had to prove his worth. He forced his muscles to obey, pushing himself up from his hands, intending to rise to his feet in a display of controlled poise. But his legs were still weak, his knees still felt disconnected from his will. He managed to push himself back to a kneeling position, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He kept his head bowed, his ash-colored hair falling forward to hide his face. "Forgive the malfunction, Your Majesty," he whispered, the words rasping from his throat. It was the first time he had spoken without being prompted by a proctor's query. The sound of his own voice was thin and reedy in the cavernous space. "My calibration requires adjustment. I will endeavor to correct the error." There was another long silence. He could feel the king's gaze on him, analytical and intense. He imagined the data streaming through the king's mind, cross-referencing his reaction with the terabytes of information provided by the Institute. He was a faulty product, a disappointment. "Look at me." The command was soft, almost gentle, but it held the same immutable weight as the first. This time, he was prepared. He fought the instinct to obey instantly, forcing a deliberate, measured response. He slowly, mechanically, lifted his head. His neck felt stiff, the muscles protesting. For the first time, he saw the Alpha King's face clearly. The data slate images had been lies. They had captured the sharp angles of his jaw, the straight line of his nose, the dark, heavy brows. But they had missed everything that mattered. They had missed the profound, soul-deep weariness in his eyes, which were not black, but a dark, stormy grey, like a winter sea. They had missed the fine lines at their corners, etched by burdens Elian could not begin to comprehend. They had missed the faint, silvery scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a tiny imperfection in a face that was otherwise flawless. He was not just a symbol of power, he was a man, and he looked impossibly, achingly tired. The king's expression was unreadable. It was not cruel, not angry, not pleased. It was a mask of regal neutrality. But his eyes were searching, probing, looking for something beyond the surface. He was not looking at Subject 734, he was looking at him. The Institute breeds obedience, the king said, his gaze unwavering. They strip away instinct and call it purity. They believe the perfect Omega is a mirror, reflecting only what is shown to it. They told me you were their masterpiece, a silent, empty vessel. He took a half-step closer, and Elian flinched, a tiny, involuntary movement. The king's eyes flickered down to the motion, then back to his face. You are not empty. The statement was a verdict, an accusation. Elian's breath hitched. I am as the Institute made me, he insisted, his voice trembling slightly. I am regulated. The corner of the king's mouth tilted, a fractional movement that was not quite a smile. It was something colder, more cynical. Are you? He murmured. He reached out, his hand moving with an unnerving slowness. Elian's every instinct screamed at him to recoil, to scramble away, but his conditioning held him paralyzed, a statue of an Omega. The king's fingers, long and cool, brushed against his cheek. The touch was electric. A shock went through Elian's system, 1,000 times more potent than any training stimulus. It was the first gentle, human touch he could ever remember. It was not the clinical grip of a proctor, the cold press of a medical device. It was skin on skin. The king's thumb stroked the line of his jaw, his gaze intensely focused on the point of contact. There is fear in you, he said, his voice a low rumble. There is confusion, and there is something else, something ancient. The Institute did not erase it. They only buried it under a layer of ice. And my voice was enough to crack it. He was exposed, laid bare. All his conditioning, all his training was a fragile shell that had been shattered by a voice and a scent. The dread intensified, choking him. He would be sent back. He would be undone. Please, he breathed, the word a desperate plea. I can be better. I can be what you require. The king's hand dropped away, and the loss of contact was a physical ache. He straightened up, his towering form once again seeming distant and unapproachable. What I require is not what the Institute produces, he said, his voice flat and dismissive. He turned away, walking toward the massive, unlit fireplace that dominated one wall. The transaction is complete. You belong to me now. Your designation is no longer Subject 734. Here, you will be known as Elian. Elian. A name. It felt foreign on his tongue, a sound without meaning. He had a number. Numbers were efficient. Names were personal. personal, was chaos. "A servant will show you to your quarters," the king continued, his back still to him. "You will be provided with appropriate attire. You will be expected to attend me at meals. Otherwise, you will remain in your rooms unless summoned. Do you understand?" "Yes, your majesty," Elian whispered to the king's back, the words tasting like ash. He was being dismissed, not sent back, not yet. He was being kept, a curiosity, a flawed specimen to be observed. The relief that washed over him was so profound it almost buckled his knees again, but it was followed by a chilling new reality. He had left the sterile, predictable prison of the Institute for this, a gilded cage ruled by an alpha whose mere presence could unravel him. He had traded a white, silent void for a world of shadows and scent and a terrifying, unpredictable king. He did not know which was worse. As a silent figure emerged from the shadows to lead him away, Elian cast one last look at the king, who stood staring into the cold, dark fireplace, as if searching for a flame that had long since gone out. His new quarters were as different from his cell at the Institute as the king's throne room had been. Where his old room was small, white, and synthetic, this space was vast, dark, and organic. The walls were panelled in a dark wood that smelled faintly of resin and age. A thick, deep blue rug covered the floor, its plush fibers a strange and wonderful sensation beneath his bare feet. A massive bed, piled high with velvet coverlets and soft linens, stood against one wall, and on the opposite wall a set of tall, arched windows looked out not onto a seamless white expanse, but onto the night. He was drawn to them, moving with a dreamlike slowness. He had never seen the night sky before. At the Institute, the passage of time was marked only by the regulated dimming and brightening of the ceiling panels. Here, the sky was a canvas of deep, profound indigo, punctured by the sharp, brilliant pinpricks of 1,000 distant stars. A sliver of moon hung like a scythe, casting a pale, ghostly light over the sprawling city below. The city itself was a tapestry of lights, a stark contrast to the darkness of the citadel which loomed over it, a silent, black mountain of stone. Rain had begun to fall, a soft, persistent drizzle that streaked the thick glass of the windows and blurred the lights into shimmering jewels. The scent of the rain, of wet stone and damp earth, drifted into the room from some unseen vent, mingling with the scent of the wood and the clean lavender and chamomile fragrance of the linens. It was a symphony of smells, each distinct, each real. He walked to the bed and hesitantly touched the coverlet. The velvet was soft, its texture a complex caress against his fingertips. He had spent his life surrounded by smooth, cold, non-porous surfaces. This was a revelation. He sank onto the edge of the bed, the mattress yielding softly beneath his weight. He ran his hand over the velvet again and again, mesmerized by the simple, tactile pleasure of it. A servant, a quiet beater with kind eyes, had brought him new clothes, not the simple white tunic of the Institute, but trousers of a soft, dark wool and a shirt of fine, cream-colored linen. They felt heavy, substantial. Dressing himself, he felt like he was putting on a costume, trying to become this new person. Elian. He looked at his hands, no longer held in the neutral, upturned posture, but resting on the dark wool of his trousers. They looked like his hands, but they also didn't. He was alone, yet he did not feel the calm of solitude he was used to. The room was filled with the lingering phantom presence of the king. His potent scent, though faded, seemed to have permeated the very fabric of the citadel. It was a constant, low-level hum beneath the other smells, a reminder of his power, of the command that had brought Elian to his knees. The memory was a brand on his consciousness, the sheer, terrifying loss of control, the way his body had betrayed his mind. He was a failure. The Institute's perfect Omega had broken within minutes of activation. He replayed the king's words. "You are not empty." It had sounded like an accusation, but there was something else in his tone, a note he couldn't decipher. Cynicism, disappointment, or something else entirely. "What I require is not what the Institute produces." What did he require then? If not the placid, obedient vessel he was designed to be, then what? The question circled in his mind, a Mobius strip of confusion. He had been trained for a single purpose, to be presented to a high-ranking alpha, to bond, and to produce a strong, genetically superior heir. His compliance was meant to ensure a smooth, emotionless transaction. His calibrated scent was meant to be a blank canvas upon which an alpha could project his own desires, ensuring a quick and stable imprinting. But the king seemed to have no interest in the transaction. He had dismissed Elian as one might dismiss a page. His interest peaked, and then just as quickly extinguished. Elian lay back on the bed, the softness of the pillows cradling his head. He stared up at the dark, vaulted ceiling, listening to the soft patter of the rain against the glass. He felt unmoored, a ship cut from its anchor and set adrift on a vast, dark sea. At the Institute, he had known his purpose. His life had been a straight line, leading to a singular point. Now, that line had dissolved. He was in a place of shadows and secrets, under the authority of a man who was himself a secret. He closed his eyes, and the king's face swam in his vision. Those weary, storm-grey eyes, the scar through his brow, the ghost of a cynical smile. He felt again the shocking warmth of his fingers on his skin. His body reacted to the memory, a soft tremor running through him. The silver band on his wrist, which had been a steady, pulsing green, flickered to yellow. Unregulated thoughts, unregulated physiological response. He took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to summon the mental exercises, the calming techniques, the litanies of neutrality he had been taught. I am a vessel. I am serene. I am control. The words felt hollow, meaningless. They were the language of the White Room, and they had no power here. Here in the dark, with the sound of the rain and the ghost of an alpha's scent, another language was being spoken, one his body understood far better than his mind. He was afraid. For the first time in his life, he was truly, profoundly afraid. And beneath the fear, so deep he could barely acknowledge it, was a flicker of something else. A tiny, fragile spark of curiosity. He was afraid of the king, but he also wanted to understand him. He wanted to know why he had looked at him with such weary, ancient eyes. He wanted to know what he saw when he said, "You are not empty." The next morning, Elian was awoken not by a chime, but by the soft, grey light of dawn filtering through the tall windows. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean. A different servant, a stern-faced Omega woman who smelled of starched linen and dried herbs, informed him that he was to attend the king for the morning meal. She helped him dress in another set of fine, dark clothes, her movements efficient and impersonal. She did not speak, and Elian, falling back on his old habits, remained silent as well. He was led not to the cavernous throne room, but to a smaller, more intimate chamber. It was a library, the walls lined from floor to ceiling with books, thousands of them. The scent of old paper and leather binding was a warm, comforting blanket in the air, a stark contrast to the king's powerful pheromones. A table was set for two near a tall window that overlooked a rain-soaked inner courtyard. The king was already there, standing by the window, his back to the door. He was dressed less formally than the night before, in a simple black tunic and trousers that did not hide the lean, powerful lines of his body. He did not turn as Elian entered. "The Institute does not permit books, I presume," he said, his voice quiet, conversational. It lacked the commanding weight of the previous night, and Elian found himself able to breathe a little easier. "No, Your Majesty," Elian replied, his voice soft. "Information is regulated, provided on data slates as needed." "Of course," the king murmured, a note of dry irony in his tone. "Unregulated information leads to unregulated thoughts." He finally turned, and his storm-grey eyes swept over Elian. His expression was as neutral as ever, but Elian felt a now familiar jolt at the intensity of his gaze. "Did you sleep?" The question was unexpected, personal. Elian hesitated. "Yes, Your Majesty." It was a lie. He had drifted in a state of anxious, shallow dozing, his mind replaying their encounter, his senses on high alert. The king's lips thinned. He knew. Of course, he knew. He could probably smell the exhaustion on him, the lingering anxiety. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the table. It was a command, but it was spoken quietly. Elian obeyed, his movements stiff and self-conscious. The king sat opposite him. The table was large, a barrier of polished dark wood between them. Servants entered silently, placing platters of food on the table. Real food. Smoked fish, dark bread, soft cheese, glistening fruits. The aromas made Elian's stomach clench with a hunger he hadn't realized he possessed. The nutrient paste he was used to had no taste, no texture, no smell. This was a feast for the senses. The king ate with a practiced, economical grace, his attention seemingly on his food. Elian watched him for a moment before picking up a piece of bread. His hands trembled slightly. He felt clumsy, uncultured. He was acutely aware of the king's presence, of the subtle shifts in his scent. Today, it was more subdued, the ozone and storm notes tempered by the scent of the library, of old paper and ink. They ate in silence for several minutes. It was not the sterile silence of the Institute, nor the charged, heavy silence of the throne room. It was a contemplative silence, filled with the soft clinking of cutlery and the distant cawing of crows from the courtyard. "The director of the Institute, Valerius, he speaks very highly of you," the king said suddenly, placing his knife and fork down. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Elian. "He considers you his greatest achievement, a perfect synthesis of nature and nurture, an omega with all the biological advantages and none of the emotional deficits." Elian swallowed the piece of bread he was chewing. It felt like a stone in his throat. "Director Valerius is a visionary," he recited, the words a pre-programmed response. "He is a butcher," the king countered, his voice flat and cold. "He takes living beings and strips them of their souls, and he calls it progress." The intensity returned to his gaze, sharp and piercing. "He told me your scent was undetectable, a perfect blank slate." He lied. Elian's blood ran cold. "Your Majesty, the moment you were brought into my presence, I smelled it," the king continued, his voice low, almost a conspiratorial whisper. "Beneath the chemical neutralizers, beneath the layers of conditioning. It was faint, almost non-existent, like a single star in a blacked-out sky. But it was there, the scent of petrichor, a night-blooming jasmine, a scent of potential. Elian stared at him, his mind reeling. His scent. He had a scent. He had been told, assured, that he was olfactorily null, a ghost. But the king had smelled him. He had seen past the illusion. "That is why I chose you," the king said, leaning forward slightly, his forearms resting on the table. "I have been presented with dozens of calibrated omegas. They were all as Valerius promised, perfect, beautiful, empty shells. They smelled of nothing. They felt of nothing. They were repulsive." A flicker of profound distaste crossed his features. "But you were different. You were not entirely erased. There was a ghost of a person still inside." Elian didn't know what to say. His entire world was tilting on its axis. He was chosen not for his perfection, but for his flaw. His failure was his value. What do you want from me?" he asked, the question a raw, honest whisper. The king's expression softened for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something that looked like empathy? Pity? "For now," he said, his voice returning to its neutral, regal tone, "I want you to eat, and then I want you to read a book." He gestured to the shelves that surrounded them. "Pick any one. The Institute starved your mind. It is time to let it feed." He stood then, his meal unfinished. "I have duties to attend to," he said, his voice once again distant. He paused at the door, his hand on the heavy iron latch. He looked back at Elian, his grey eyes unreadable. "Valerius believes he has given me a perfectly controllable tool, a weapon of compliance to secure my bloodline and solidify his own power in my court. He is a fool." The king's gaze hardened. He has no idea what he has truly unleashed. With that, he was gone, leaving Elian alone in the silent, scent-filled library, the king's words echoing in the vast space. He was not a tool. He was a weapon, and he was sitting in the heart of an arsenal, surrounded by thousands of books, each one a universe of unregulated thoughts. He looked from the half-eaten food on his plate to the towering shelves, and for the first time since leaving the White Room, the fear began to recede, replaced by a terrifying, thrilling flicker of something new. Hope. Days bled into a week. Elian's life settled into a strange new rhythm, dictated by the silent rules of the citadel and the whims of its enigmatic king. He took his meals with Kaelin. He had learned the king's name from a talkative beta servant in the vast library. Their conversations, if they could be called that, were sparse and stilted. Kaelin would ask him about the book he was reading, his questions precise and analytical. He would inquire about the food, about Elian's sleep. The inquiries felt less like personal interest and more like a scientist observing an experiment, taking careful notes on the subject's adaptation to a new environment. And Elian was adapting. His senses, so long suppressed, were slowly, painfully, coming alive. He spent his days exploring the library, his sanctuary. At first, he had been paralyzed by choice. The sheer volume of books was overwhelming. He had finally chosen one at random, a slim volume of poetry bound in faded blue leather. The words were a foreign language of emotion. He didn't understand most of them, the metaphors of love and loss, of rage and joy. But he liked the sound of them in his head, the rhythm and cadence. He read them aloud sometimes, his own voice a hesitant whisper in the quiet room, tasting the shapes of the words on his tongue. He discovered textures, the rough, fibrous texture of old paper, the smooth, cool grain of the wooden shelves, the yielding plushness of the velvet armchair he claimed as his own. He discovered colors beyond white and black, the deep crimson of a book's binding, the gold leaf illuminating a manuscript, the myriad shades of green in the moss growing on the courtyard stones outside the window. And he discovered scent. The library was his favorite place, not just for the books, but for its smell, a comforting, complex blend of aging paper, leather, beeswax, and the ever-present phantom of the king's own scent, which seemed to have soaked into the very wood of the shelves. When Kaelin was present, his scent was a living thing, shifting with his moods. Elian was beginning to learn its language, the sharp tang of ozone when he was tense or angry, a scent that made Elian's own body clench in sympathetic anxiety, the deep grounding note of damp earth when he was contemplative, and sometimes, very rarely, when he thought Elian wasn't looking, a fleeting, almost imperceptible hint of something that smelled like loneliness and burnt-out embers. Elian's own scent, the one Kaelin had spoken of, remained a mystery to him. He would press his face into the sleeve of his shirt, inhaling deeply, but he could smell nothing but the fabric and the lavender soap he now used. It was like trying to see his own eyes without a mirror. He knew it was there because Kaelin had told him so, but it was an invisible, intangible part of himself. His body was changing too. The real food, rich and varied, was replacing the nutrient paste. He felt a new strength in his limbs, a new energy humming beneath his skin. But with it came other, less welcome changes. His instincts, cracked open by Kaelin's command, were becoming more prominent. He found himself startling at sudden noises. He felt a constant, low-level hum of anxiety when he was in the vast, empty corridors of the citadel. He felt a primal, instinctual need to be near the king, the source of that powerful, grounding alpha scent. The proximity was both a comfort and a torment. His conditioning screamed that this dependence was a weakness, a flaw. His instinct screamed that it was survival. One evening, as rain lashed against the library windows, creating a cozy, insulated world, within the stone walls, Kaelin seemed more distant than usual. He pushed his food around his plate, his jaw tight, the scent of ozone sharp in the air. Elian kept his head down, focusing on the book in his lap, a history of the pre-unification wars. He was pretending to read, but every nerve was attuned to the king's silent, simmering anger. "Valerius contacted me today," Kaelin said abruptly, his voice a low growl. Elian's head snapped up. The name was a splash of ice water. "He inquired as to your progress. He wishes to know if the asset is performing to specification." Elian's blood ran cold. "And what did you tell him, Your Majesty?" Kaelin's stormy grey eyes met his. "I told him your integration was proceeding as planned. I told him you were compliant." The word tasted like a lie on the king's tongue. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "He wants to see you." The room seemed to shrink, the air growing thick and hard to breathe. See him, Valerius. The thought of returning to that presence, of being subjected to that cold, analytical gaze, sent a wave of pure terror through him. He could feel the phantom sensation of the director's sterile gloves, the cold press of diagnostic tools. "No," Elian breathed, the word escaping before he could stop it. It was an act of defiance, an unregulated, emotional response. He flinched, expecting anger, a reprimand. But Kaelin's expression was not angry. It was grimly satisfied. "No," he repeated softly. He believes you are his creature, a puppet whose strings he holds. He does not understand that I have cut them." Kalen stood and walked to the window, staring out at the storm-swept darkness. He sees our kingdom as a machine, and people as its cogs. Alphas, betas, omegas, all just components to be optimized for maximum efficiency. The calibrated Omega program is his magnum opus, an Omega with no will, no desire, no messy emotions to complicate the neat equation of lineage and power. A perfect broodmare for the ruling class. The clinical, detached way he said it made Elian's stomach churn. That was what he was, what he was meant to be. He underestimates the very thing he seeks to control, Kalen continued, his voice a low murmur, almost to himself. Nature, instinct. The bond between an alpha and an omega is not a simple transaction of dominance and submission. It is a resonance, a feedback loop, a power that can build or destroy empires. He turned from the window, and his eyes burned with a cold fire. My father, his father. They ruled through fear and brute force. They saw omegas as property, as tools. Their bonds were shallow, built on dominance alone, and their reigns were marked by instability and rebellion. The kingdom rotted from the inside out. He walked back toward the table, his movements slow, deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. But his gaze was not predatory. It was filled with a deep, aching sorrow. I will not make their mistakes. I will not rule a kingdom of cogs. I will not take an empty vessel as my mate. He stopped before Elian, so close that Elian had to crane his neck to look up at him. The scent of storm and earth and sorrow was overwhelming. Valerius thinks he has given me a key to lock down my power. I believe he has given me a key to dismantle his entire system. But only if you are more than he made you. Only if the person inside is strong enough to break the rest of the way out. He reached down, his fingers brushing against the cover of the history book in Elian's lap. This is a start, he said softly. But books are not enough. Your mind is waking up, but your body, your instincts, are still a cage. And a cage, no matter how gilded, is still a prison. Without another word, he turned and left the library, the great doors closing with a soft thud behind him, leaving Elian trembling in the warm, lamp-lit circle of light. The king's words were a terrifying validation. He wasn't a failure to be fixed. He was a weapon to be sharpened. And the person he was fighting was not the king, but the ghost of the man who had created him, Director Valerius. The true war was not for a kingdom, but for his own soul. And he had just been told by the most powerful alpha in the world that he was expected to win. The king's words became a crucible. Elian's quiet life in the library was over. Kalen began to draw him out, slowly, deliberately, into the wider world of the Citadel. It was a form of therapy, a resensitization program designed by an alpha king. Instead of an institute director, he was taken to the kitchens, a cavern of steam and noise and 1,000 competing smells, baking bread, roasting meat, sharp herbs, sweet fruits. The head cook, a bustling grandmotherly Omega, pressed a warm roll into his hands, her own scent a comforting mix of yeast and cinnamon. Elian, accustomed to a lifetime of no physical contact, flinched at the casual touch, but the woman just smiled, her eyes crinkling. He was taken to the stables, a place of overwhelming organic life. The scent of hay and horse and worn leather was thick in the air. Kalen led him to a stall holding a mare with a coat the color of dark honey. Her eyes were large, liquid, and intelligent. "Touch her," Kalen commanded, his voice soft. Elian hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached out. The mare snorted, her warm breath ghosting over his skin, and then she nudged his palm with her velvety nose. The connection was startling, a simple, profound communication with another living being that required no words. He was taken to the armory, where the air tasted of metal and oil and the cold, sharp scent of whetstones. He ran his hand over the hilt of a sword, its leather-wrapped grip worn smooth by the hands of long-dead warriors. He felt the weight of it, the history. Each new experience was a chisel, chipping away at the smooth, sterile surface of his conditioning. With each new sensory input, his own inner world grew more complex, more chaotic. His emotions, once a placid, waveless sea, were now a roiling tide. He experienced moments of breathtaking wonder, like seeing the sunrise paint the sky in hues of rose and gold from the top of the highest tower. He experienced moments of sharp, poignant sadness when reading a tragic poem. And he experienced a growing, confusing tangle of feelings for the king himself. Kalen remained an enigma. He was his guide, his teacher, his warden. He was a source of immense, terrifying power, and yet Elian had seen flickers of a profound vulnerability in him. He watched the way Kalen interacted with his court during the brief, formal audiences Elian was now required to silently attend. He saw the mask of command, the cold, calculating mind that assessed every word, every gesture. He saw the weight of the crown in the tension of Kalen's shoulders, in the weary lines around his eyes that even the dim lighting of the throne room could not hide. Then there were the quiet moments. Late at night in the library, after the servants had cleared their meal, Kalen would sometimes speak of his own past. Not of politics or strategy, but small, personal fragments. He spoke of learning to ride in the very stables he had taken Elian to, of a fall that had given him the scar through his eyebrow. He spoke of his mother, an Omega from a distant northern province, who had loved the rain and had filled the castle with the scent of the wild roses that grew in her homeland. She had died when he was young. He did not speak of his father, the former king, at all. During one of these late-night conversations, Elian found the courage to ask a question that had been burning in him. "Your scent," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "It smells of the storm, of ozone, but sometimes it smells of rain. My mother, the Omega who birthed me. I have a file, a data fragment. It said she smelled of petrichor, the scent of rain on dry earth." Kalen, who had been staring into the fire he'd lit in the hearth, turned his head. The firelight danced in his grey eyes, making them seem molten. "An alpha's scent is not a single note," he said softly. "It is a chord. What the world perceives, what I project, is the ozone, the lightning, the power. It is a shield, a weapon. But the core of it, the truth of it, that is something different. It is shaped by what we value, what we love, what we have lost." He looked at Elian, and his gaze was so intense it felt like a physical touch. "Your mother smelled of rain. My mother loved the rain. And you, the first time I scented you, underneath all of Valerius's chemicals, was the promise of rain after a long drought." The confession hung in the air between them, intimate and fragile. He was not just a political tool, he was a personal one. A connection to a past Kalen had lost, a hope for a future he wanted to build. The knowledge was a heavy weight, a responsibility that terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. This new intimacy, this fragile, budding connection, was a dangerous thing. It made him vulnerable, It made them vulnerable. The court was a nest of vipers, and Kalen's favor toward a flawed, calibrated Omega was a source of gossip and political maneuvering. Elian saw the way the other council members looked at him, their eyes cold and calculating. They were Valerius's creatures, men who believed in the old ways, in the system of cogs and machines. They saw Elian not as a person, but as a symbol of the king's weakness, his deviation from the established order. The pressure was building, a storm gathering on the horizon. Elian could feel it in the tension that radiated from Kalen, in the increasingly sharp scent of ozone that clung to him like a shroud, and he could feel it in his own body. A strange heat was building deep within him, a slow, simmering fire that had nothing to do with the hearths in the citadel. His instincts, now fully awake, recognized it. It was the precursor to his first heat, a biological imperative his conditioning had been designed to suppress, but which his reawakened body was now hurtling toward with unstoppable force. He tried to hide it, to control it. He spent more time in his rooms, the cool air a balm against his flushed skin. But it was a losing battle. His own scent, the one he still couldn't smell himself, was changing, growing sweeter, the notes of night-blooming jasmine becoming more pronounced. He knew this because of the way Kalen watched him. The king's composure was absolute, but Elian saw the subtle flare of his nostrils when he entered a room, the way his grey eyes darkened, the tight grip of his hand on the arm of his chair. The air between them was electric, a high-tension wire humming with unspoken things. The breaking point came one afternoon. Kalen had been locked in a contentious meeting with his council for hours. Elian had retreated to the library, trying to lose himself in a book, but the words swam before his eyes. The heat was a persistent thrumming under his skin, a feverish ache in his bones. He felt restless, agitated, his body craving something he could not name. The library doors burst open, and Kalen strode in. He was alone, and he was radiating fury. The scent of ozone was so strong it was almost suffocating, a crackling, palpable energy that filled the room. "They dare to question me," he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He paced the length of the room like a caged wolf. "They speak of a tradition, of stability. They speak of my father's legacy. They want me to set you aside, to take a proper Omega, one of their own choosing, from one of their own families. They called you a defective toy, an institute reject." Every word was a blow. Elian flinched, curling into himself in the armchair. The fear and shame were a bitter taste in his mouth. Kalen stopped his pacing, and his head snapped toward Elian, his eyes wild. "And Valerius, he sends his regards. He suggests that if your performance is not satisfactory, he would be happy to take you back for recalibration." The threat, the one that had haunted Elian's nightmares, spoken aloud in the king's furious voice, was the final straw. The tenuous control he had over his own body snapped. A wave of heat, so intense it made him gasp, washed through him. His vision swam. The scents in the room, paper, leather, fire and Kalen's rage, blended into a dizzying, overwhelming cacophony. A soft, desperate keen escaped his lips, a sound he had never made before. His own scent, the one he'd never been able to perceive, exploded from him. A sweet, intoxicating wave of petrichor and jasmine, laced with a new, musky undertone of pure, unadulterated need. It was the scent of an Omega in full heat. Kalen froze. His rage, the crackling ozone, was instantly smothered by the flood of Elian's pheromones. The Alpha King's head jerked back as if struck. His eyes, which had been burning with anger, widened, the pupils dilating until the grey was almost entirely consumed by black. The scent in the room changed in a heartbeat. The ozone vanished, replaced by something deeper, darker, more primal. The scent of rich, dark earth, of lightning striking that earth, a scent of possessive, absolute dominance. It was the scent of an alpha in rut. He had been a king, furious at his council. Now he was just an alpha, confronted with the scent of his omega, in distress. The two forces, the king and the alpha, warred in his eyes. He took a step toward Elian, his hand outstretched, then clenched it into a fist, his knuckles white. "Elian," he growled, his voice thick, guttural, almost unrecognizable. It was not a command. It was a plea. But Elian couldn't answer. His body was no longer his own. The heat was a firestorm, burning away thought, reason, and all the fragile layers of his new identity. There was only instinct now. The instinct to seek comfort, to seek safety, to seek the grounding presence of his alpha. He slid from the chair and onto the floor, his limbs weak and trembling. He crawled toward Kalen, his movements clumsy, desperate. He was not Subject 734. He was not the boy who read poetry. He was an omega in heat, and he was seeking his alpha. The carefully constructed world they had been building together was about to be consumed by the very fire they had both tried so hard to control. The world had dissolved into a maelstrom of heat and need. Elian's vision tunneled until the only thing he could see was the king's boots planted on the Persian rug. The intricate patterns of the rug swam, blurring into a sea of red and gold. His mind was gone, replaced by a singular, blinding imperative. Alpha. The word was not a thought, but a physical ache in his chest, a yearning that vibrated through every cell. He reached the king's feet and collapsed, his cheek pressing against the cool leather of his boot. He inhaled, and Kalen's rut-thick scent was a balm on his frayed nerves, a promise of anchorage in the storm. A soft, pleading whimper escaped his throat, a sound of pure animal need. He heard a choked sound from above him. Kalen, the king, the alpha. He felt a tremor run through the leg he was pressed against. A hand, large and shaking, settled on his head, the fingers tangling in his ash-colored hair. The touch was not gentle. It was possessive, desperate. "Gods, Elian," Kalen rasped, his voice strained, a battleground of control and instinct. "Get up. You cannot. We cannot." But Elian couldn't get up. He couldn't do anything but press closer, seeking more of that grounding scent, that stabilizing presence. He tilted his head back, exposing the pale, vulnerable line of his throat. It was an invitation, an offering, the most profound gesture of submission an Omega could make. Claim me, mark me, make me yours. The thoughts were not his own, but the instincts of 1,000 generations speaking through him. Kalen's breath hitched. His hand tightened in Elian's hair, not painfully, but with an agonizing tension. Elian could feel the war inside him. The king who wanted to dismantle the system, to save Elian from being a mere vessel, was fighting a losing battle against the alpha who was biologically hardwired to respond to this scent, this offering. The scent of ozone began to creep back into Kalen's pheromones, warring with the dark earthiness of his rut, the scent of conflict, of self-loathing. "This is what he wants," Kalen growled, the words torn from his throat. "This is what Valerius and his cronies want, for me to lose myself, to take you like an animal, to bind you in instinct and heat, to prove I am no better than my father. His hand trembled violently. To prove their system works, that in the end we are all just biology. He let go of Alien's hair, as if burned. He took a staggering step back. The loss of contact was a physical blow. Alien cried out, a thin, wounded sound, and reached a hand out for him, his fingers grasping at empty air. No, Kalen said, his voice shaking but firm. He was speaking to himself as much as to Alien. I will not. I will not be him. He turned and strode to the great oak table, slamming his palms down on its surface. He bowed his head, his shoulders heaving as he dragged in ragged breaths, fighting for control. The scent of ozone and storm surged, a desperate attempt to conquer the primal scent of rut. Alien, abandoned on the floor, felt a new sensation pierce through the fog of his heat. Rejection. It was a cold, sharp agony that was almost worse than the fire in his veins. He had offered everything, his most vulnerable self, and he had been pushed away. The conditioning, the voice of the Institute whispered in the back of his mind. Defective, unwanted, failure. Tears, hot and thick, welled in his eyes and streamed down his face, the first tears he had shed since he was a small child in the Institute's creche, before they had conditioned the emotion out of him. The saltiness on his lips was a shocking, alien taste. The pain of the rejection, the shame, the physical agony of the heat. It was too much. His body convulsed with a sob, a raw, ugly sound of pure misery. The sound shattered the tense silence. Kalen's head snapped up, his eyes, wild with his own battle, focused on Elian's crying form on the floor, and the war in his eyes ended. The alpha, the king, the politician, they all vanished, replaced by something else, something fierce and tender and wholly protective. In 2 long strides, he was across the room. He didn't hesitate this time. He knelt on the rug and gathered Elian into his arms. He pulled Elian against his chest, holding him tightly, tucking his head under his chin. Elian stiffened for a moment in shock, then collapsed against him, his sobs breaking free, his hands weakly gripping the front of Kalen's tunic. "Hush," Kalen murmured into his hair, his voice no longer a growl, but a low, soothing rumble. "Shh, Elian, it's all right. I've got you. I'm not rejecting you." He began to rock him, a slow, steady rhythm, like a parent comforting a child. And he changed his scent. It was a conscious, deliberate act of will. He suppressed the aggressive, dominant notes of rut, the sharp tang of ozone. He called forth the scent Elian had only glimpsed before, the scent of his mother, the scent of rain, of cool, damp earth, of petrichor and wet leaves. It was a scent of safety, of sanctuary, of home. It washed over Elian, dousing the frantic flames of his heat, not extinguishing them, but banking them, soothing them. The violent, desperate need receded, leaving a deep, throbbing ache, but it was manageable now. He was still crying, but the sobs were no longer a product of shame and rejection, but of a profound, overwhelming relief. Kalen held him, his large hand stroking Elian's back in slow, calming circles. "I am so sorry," he whispered, his lips against Elian's hair. "I was fighting myself, not you. I was so afraid of becoming the monster they want me to be that I hurt you. Forgive me." Elian couldn't speak. He just clung to him, inhaling the scent of rain and safety, the tears slowly subsiding. This was not in any of the Institute's data slates. An alpha, in the grip of his own rut, consciously choosing to comfort and soothe an omega in heat rather than claim him. An alpha apologizing, an alpha showing this level of control, of tenderness. It was impossible. It was a revelation. After a long time, when Elian's breathing had evened out and his shudders had ceased, Kalen shifted. "Come," he said softly. The words were a gentle echo of that first devastating command. But this time they held no power but the power of care. He carefully, gently, scooped Elian up into his arms. Elian was not small, but Kalen lifted him as if he weighed nothing, cradling him against his chest. He carried him from the library through the silent, shadowy corridors to Elian's own chambers. The servants they passed flattened themselves against the walls, their heads bowed, their eyes wide, a mixture of fear and awe on their faces at the sight of their king carrying the calibrated Omega. Kalen paid them no mind. His focus was entirely on the man in his arms. He laid Elian down on the large, soft bed, pulling the velvet coverlet up over him. The heat was still there, a deep, pulsing ache, but the frantic edge was gone. Elian felt boneless, exhausted, his body heavy with a strange, languid peace. Kalen sat on the edge of the bed, his hand resting on Elian's forehead, his thumb stroking his temple. His scent was a constant, soothing presence. "You need to rest," he said, his voice low. "Your body is going through something it was never meant to experience. Let it happen. I will stay with you. I will not leave you alone." Elian looked up at him, at the king who had set aside his crown, at the alpha who had mastered his own instinct. He saw the weariness back in his eyes, but it was tempered now with a fierce tenderness. He saw the truth. Kalen had not chosen him for a flaw. He had not chosen him as a weapon. He had chosen him because, in the ghost of a scent, he had recognized a kindred spirit, another soul trapped by a system, another person yearning for the rain. "Kalen," Elian whispered, the name feeling right on his tongue for the first time. Kalen's expression softened. "I'm here, Elian," he said. "I'm here." He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was Elian, and he was not alone. As he drifted into a deep, feverish sleep, surrounded by the scent of safety, he knew that whatever happened next, whatever battles they had to fight against Valerius and the world, they would fight them together. The bond between them had not been forged in the fire of instinct and lust, as the world would have demanded. It had been forged in a moment of choice, a moment of control, a moment of profound, impossible tenderness, and that, he was beginning to understand, was a power far greater than any primal urge. Kalen did not leave his side. For 3 days, as the heat crested and ebbed, he was a constant, grounding presence. He sat in a chair pulled close to the bed, sometimes reading from a book of poetry in his low, resonant voice, the words a soothing balm. Sometimes he simply sat in silence, a sentinel watching over Elian's feverish sleep. He ensured a steady supply of cool water and light broth was brought, holding the cup to Elian's lips himself, his movements gentle and patient. He maintained his calming scent, a constant shield of rain and damp earth that kept the worst of the frantic, desperate edges of the heat at bay. It was an act of extraordinary endurance and control. Elian, in his more lucid moments, could see the cost. He saw the taut lines of strain around Kalen's mouth, the deep, bruised-looking shadows under his eyes. He could feel the tightly leashed power in him, the rut he was ruthlessly suppressing through sheer force of will. He was neglecting his kingdom, his council, his duties, all to tend to a single, broken Omega. It was an act of profound political folly and an even more profound act of devotion. During those 3 days, something fundamental shifted within Elian. The last vestiges of his conditioning burned away in the fever of the heat, leaving behind something new and raw. He was no longer a machine observing its own malfunction. He was a man, experiencing the full, terrifying, beautiful spectrum of his own being. He felt the agony of his body's yearning, but he also felt the deep, soul-shaking comfort of Kalen's presence. He learned the difference between the blind, biological pull toward an alpha and the conscious, emotional pull toward a specific person. He wanted Kalen, not just the alpha, but the man who read poetry, who had a scar above his eye, who smelled of sorrow and rain, who had chosen tenderness over power. On the 4th morning, Elian woke up, and the fever was gone. The deep ache in his bones had subsided to a dull throb. The world was clear again, the colors in the room sharp and distinct. He felt weak, exhausted, but he also felt clean, as if he had been passed through a fire and reborn. Kalen was asleep in the chair, his head fallen back against the high backrest, his face haggard in the pale morning light. His mask of command was gone, and in its place was a vulnerability that made Elian's chest ache. He looked young, burdened, and so incredibly tired. His scent, in sleep, had lost some of its deliberate control. The dark, earthy notes of his suppressed rut mingled with the scent of rain, a scent of deep, restless longing. Quietly, Elian slipped out of bed. His legs were shaky, but they held him. He found a thick blanket folded on a chest at the foot of the bed and gently draped it over the sleeping king. Kalen stirred, his brow furrowing, but he did not wake. Elian stood for a long moment, just looking at him. He reached out, his fingers hesitating just inches from Kalen's face, wanting to smooth the lines of worry from his brow, to offer some small comfort in return for the immense comfort he had been given. He pulled his hand back. The intimacy of the gesture was still too new, too frightening. Instead, he went to the window. The sun was rising over the city, and the sky was a delicate, watercolor wash of pink and orange. He could smell the morning, the distant scent of bread baking in the city ovens, the clean, cool air, the damp stone of the citadel. He took a deep breath, and for the first time he smelled it. Faintly, underneath the other scents, he caught a whisper of his own fragrance on the air, the clean scent of petrichor, the sweet, ghostly perfume of night-blooming jasmine. It was his. It was him. A soft sound made him turn. Kalen was awake. He was watching him, his grey eyes clear and lucid. The blanket was pooled in his lap. He hadn't pushed it away. "Elian," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "You should have slept in a bed," Elian said softly. "You look exhausted." A faint smile touched Kalen's lips. "The alpha in me would have considered that a breach of duty. I was on guard." "You were more than that," Elian said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name, gratitude or affection. "You were kind." Kalen's smile faded. He looked down at his hands, then back up at Elian. "Kindness is a luxury my father believed a king could not afford. He ruled through fear. He believed that to be alpha was to dominate. He broke my mother, not with violence, but with neglect, with control. He locked her in a gilded cage and demanded she be beautiful and silent. When she finally faded away, he saw it not as a tragedy, but as a failure of her constitution. The bitterness in his voice was a raw, open wound. "I will not be him. I cannot be him." You are not, Elian said, with a certainty that surprised him. He took a step toward Kaelin. What you did for me, that was not control. That was respect. Kaelin stood up, his movements stiff. He walked to stand beside Elian at the window. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the city wake up. The space between them was no longer a chasm of rank and power, but an intimate quiet, comfortable and charged. The council is in an uproar, Kaelin said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. My absence has been noted. Rumors are spreading. They see this as the final proof of my unsuitability, that I am ruled by an Omega's heat, just as my father was ruled by his own ruts. They do not understand the difference. What will you do? Elian asked. I will do what I should have done from the beginning, Kaelin said, his voice hardening, the king returning. I will stop playing their game. Valerius and his faction believe they can control the board because they designed the pieces. It's time to show them what happens when one of the pieces starts moving on its own. He turned to face Elian, his expression grim. He will make a move now. He has to. He will see my actions as a weakness, an emotional failing. He will try to remove you, to reclaim his asset. We must be ready. The fear, which had been so blessedly absent, returned with a cold prickle. How? The annual rite of fealty is in 2 days, Kaelin explained. It is a grand, formal ceremony. All the High Lords and Council members will be present to renew their vows to the crown. It is a display of power and stability. Valerius will use it as a stage. He will try to humiliate me, to expose you as defective, to prove to the court that my choice has endangered the kingdom. He will try to force my hand. Elian's heart hammered against his ribs. A public confrontation, in front of the entire court. The thought of all those eyes on him, of being put on display, judged and condemned, was terrifying. He wanted to shrink away, to hide in the library with his books and the scent of rain. As if reading his mind, Kaelin reached out and took his hand. His fingers were warm and strong, engulfing Elian's. The contact was grounding, a silent promise. You will not be alone, he said, his voice low and intense. I will be beside you. But this is not my fight to win. It is yours. Elian looked at their joined hands, his own, pale and slender. Kaelin's, larger, calloused, a king's hand. What must I do? He whispered. You must do nothing, Kaelin said, his grip tightening. You must simply be, not Subject 734, not the calibrated Omega, not the Institute's creation. You must be Elian, the man who survived their erasure, the man who reads poetry and is not afraid of the rain. You must stand before them, and you must be whole. Your very existence, whole and unbroken, is a defiance to everything they believe. It will be your weapon and your shield. He raised Elian's hand, his gaze burning into his. Can you do that? Elian looked into those stormy grey eyes, saw the faith there, the desperate hope. He saw the king, who was risking his crown, not for a political strategy, but for a belief in a single, broken person. He thought of the feel of velvet, the smell of old books, the taste of real food, the warmth of a horse's nose, the sound of poetry read in a low voice. He thought of the scent of rain. He was not empty. He was full, full of new and fragile things, but full nonetheless. He took a deep breath, and for the first time he did not have to search for his own scent. He could feel it, a quiet, steady presence within him. Petrica and jasmine, the scent of a survivor. He met Kaelin's gaze, and his own was steady. Yes, he said, his voice clear and strong. I can. The rite of fealty was a spectacle of power. The grand hall of the citadel, a space Elian had never seen, was ablaze with light from 1,000 candles, their flames reflecting off the polished marble floors and the jewels adorning the assembled lords and ladies of the realm. The air was thick with the cloying scents of expensive perfumes, spiced wine, and ambition. It was a sensory assault, a world away from the quiet solitude of the library. Elian stood in a shadowed alcove just off the main hall, Kalen at his side. He was dressed in formal attire of deep blue velvet that seemed to drink the light, a stark contrast to the glittering finery of the court. It felt like a ghost at a feast, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. His hands were cold and clammy. "Breathe," Kalen murmured, his voice a low vibration near Elian's ear. His own scent was a tightly controlled shield of cool stone and ozone, the king's public face. But beneath it, Elian could sense the deep, grounding note of earth, a private signal, meant only for him. They are just people, vain, frightened people, hiding behind titles and silk. Elian took a shaky breath, trying to anchor himself in the king's presence. He looked out at the sea of faces. He saw them, the members of Kalen's council, standing near the great obsidian throne, and among them, a man he recognized instantly from the data files, a man he had never met, but whose presence had haunted his entire life. Director Valerius. He was a tall, slender man with a face that looked like it was carved from ice. He wore the severe, unadorned grey robes of the Institute, a stark statement of his identity amidst the court's opulence. His eyes, a pale, chilling blue, swept the room with an air of detached, scientific observation. He looked like he was cataloguing insects, not attending a royal ceremony. When his gaze passed over the alcove where Elian and Kalen stood, it lingered for a fraction of a second, and a cold, knowing smile touched his thin lips. He knew. He was ready. A herald's trumpet blew, a clarion call that silenced the chatter. The court arranged itself. Kalen squeezed Elian's shoulder once, a brief, hard pressure. "It is time." Kalen stepped out into the light, moving toward the throne with a fluid, predatory grace. A murmur went through the crowd as they saw him, their king. He was a figure of absolute authority, his face a mask of cold command. But Elian, watching from the shadows, saw the minute tension in his jaw, the white-knuckled grip of his hand on the hilt of the ceremonial sword at his side. Then the herald called a new name, a name that had never been spoken in this hall. Elian, chosen of the king. A collective gasp went through the hall. All eyes turned toward the alcove. This was it. The stage was set. Elian's legs felt like lead. His conditioning screamed at him to stay hidden, to remain unseen, to be nothing. But Kalen's words echoed in his mind. "You must be whole." He took one step, then another, emerging from the shadows into the blinding candlelight. He kept his eyes fixed on Kalen, who had reached the throne but had not sat upon it. He was standing before it, waiting for him. The walk across the marble floor felt 1,000 miles long. He could feel the weight of hundreds of pairs of eyes on him, dissecting him, judging him. He could hear the whispers, the sibilant hiss of his designation. Calibrated, the Institute Omega. Defective. He reached the dais and stopped at the foot of the steps leading to the throne, a few feet from Kalen. He did not bow his head. He did not lower his eyes. He kept his gaze on Kalen, a silent declaration of allegiance that was for the king alone. The ceremony began. One by one, the High Lords approached, knelt and recited the ancient oath of fealty. Kalen responded with the traditional words, his voice ringing with power and authority. It was a hypnotic, ancient ritual, but Elian could feel the tension mounting. This was just the prelude. The main act was yet to come. Finally, the last lord had spoken. A tense silence fell over the hall. This was the moment. Director Valerius stepped forward. He did not approach the throne. He stopped in the middle of the hall, turning to face the assembled court. "Lords and ladies of the realm," he began, his voice not loud, but clear and sharp as glass, carrying to every corner of the room. "We have renewed our vows to the king, a symbol of our kingdom's strength and continuity, a continuity that depends on the strength of the king's bloodline." His pale eyes flickered toward Elian. A bloodline secured by a proper, stable union. He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "Our king, in his wisdom, has chosen a companion from my institute, a calibrated Omega, designed for perfection, for stability, for obedience." He smiled that cold, thin smile again. "However, it has come to my attention that the asset, that is, the Omega Elian, has been displaying certain anomalies, regressive behaviors, emotional volatility, a failure of his core programming." A wave of murmurs swept the crowd. Kalen remained perfectly still, his face unreadable, but Elian could see a muscle twitching in his jaw. "Such a defect," Valerius continued, his voice laced with false concern, "is not merely a personal matter. It is a matter of state. A volatile, unstable Omega cannot be relied upon to secure the royal line. Such a union would be a foundation of sand, threatening the very stability of our kingdom." He turned his chilling gaze directly on Elian. "The Institute is, of course, prepared to rectify the situation, to take the asset back for full recalibration, to restore him to his intended perfect state." He was offering Kalen an out, a public way to discard his mistake and save face, to bow to the system. Kalen spoke, his voice dangerously quiet. "And if I refuse your generous offer, Director?" Valerius's smile widened. "Then I fear we must have a demonstration, to show the court the true nature of this flaw." He raised a hand, and from his sleeve he produced a small silver atomizer. A failsafe, a simple olfactory trigger, keyed to the Omega's initial conditioning. A command sent. It will revert him to his base programming. Absolute mindless submission. It will show you all what a broken tool looks like. Panic, cold, and absolute seized Elian. A command sent. A chemical key to unlock his deepest prison. He felt an involuntary tremor start in his legs. "You would not dare," Kalen snarled, taking a step forward. "I would," Valerius said calmly, "for the good of the kingdom." And he pressed the atomizer. A fine, invisible mist shot into the air. It had no discernible smell to a normal nose, but to an Omega's heightened senses, it was a thunderclap. It was the scent of the Institute, of sterility, of cold metal and antiseptics, concentrated into a single, overwhelming command. Obey. It hit Elian like a physical blow. His vision went white. The sounds of the hall faded into a distant roar. The world dissolved, and he was back in the white room, a subject, a number. His mind emptied. His body went slack. The imperative was absolute. Submit. Be nothing. Be silent. His knees buckled. He was falling, the same involuntary submission as that first day. But this time it was not instinct. It was a chemical cage slamming shut. He was going down, his body obeying the command, his consciousness fading into a grey fog. But as he fell, a new scent cut through the sterile fog of the trigger. It was faint, but it was there. Rain, damp earth, a king's sorrow, Kaelin. A memory flashed behind his eyes. Kaelin, holding him, rocking him, his voice a low murmur. I'm here, Elian. I'm here. Another memory. Kaelin's hand in his. You must be whole. The fog wavered. Two commands were at war within him. The chemical imperative of the Institute and the emotional imperative of the man who had shown him kindness. Obey. Be whole. He fought. On his knees, halfway to the floor, his body trembling violently, he fought. He dragged his head up, his neck muscles straining. He saw Valerius watching him with a triumphant, clinical curiosity. He saw the court, their faces a mixture of pity, a morbid fascination. And he saw Kaelin. Kaelin was standing frozen, his face a mask of agony. He was watching Elian fall, watching his own hope crumble, and he was respecting his word. He was not interfering. He was letting this be Elian's fight. The trust, the faith in that pained gaze was a lifeline. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was Elian. With a ragged gasp that was a sob and a roar all at once, he drove his palms into the marble floor. He pushed. He fought against the chemical chains, against a lifetime of conditioning. He pushed himself back up, not to his feet, not yet. He rose from his collapsing submission to a firm, solid kneeling position. He lifted his head, and he looked at Valerius. His eyes were streaming with tears of exertion and pain, but they were clear. They were his own. Then he did something no calibrated Omega should ever be able to do. He spoke, his voice raw, but ringing with defiance. No. The single word, a universe of rebellion, echoed in the stunned silence of the hall. Valerius's smile vanished. His face, for the first time, showed a flicker of shock, of disbelief. Elian was not finished. He turned his head, his gaze finding Kaelin. He looked at his king, his alpha, his friend. And in front of the entire court, he reached deep inside himself, past the pain and the fear, and he did the one thing that was his and his alone. He released his scent, not the faint, ghostly whisper it had been. He pushed it out with all his newfound will, a powerful, undeniable wave of petrichor and night-blooming jasmine. It was not the scent of an Omega in heat, begging for a mate. It was the scent of an Omega who was whole, unbroken, and choosing his alpha. It was a scent of loyalty, a scent of love. It wrapped around Kaelin, a fragrant, visible declaration for all to see. Kaelin inhaled, his eyes closing for a fraction of a second. The tension in his body eased. A slow, genuine smile, the first Elian had ever truly seen, spread across his face. It was breathtaking. He opened his eyes and looked not at Valerius, but at the assembled court. His voice, when he spoke, was not the cold command of a king, but the warm, proud statement of a man. "This is my Omega," he said simply, "whole, strong, and mine by choice, not by design." He then held out his hand to Elian. "Elian, come here." It was the same command that had shattered him on the first day. But now, it was not a trigger for submission. It was an invitation, an offering of a partnership. Elian looked at the outstretched hand. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs still trembling, but holding him steady. He walked up the 2 steps of the dais, and he took the king's hand. Their fingers interlaced, a perfect fit, and together they turned to face the world. Valerius stood gaping, his silver atomizer looking like a cheap, useless toy. He had lost. His system was broken. His perfect cog had grown a soul.